Okay, well, let's just go ahead and get started then. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. My name is William Figueroa. I am a research associate here at the Center for Geopolitics, and I want to welcome you to our event today, which is the Geopolitics of China's Belt and Road Initiative and Westward Focus. Please join us, very pleased to have today with us Professor Anoush Ehteshami. He's a professor of international relations in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. He's also the Nasser al-Mohammad al-Sabah chair in the international relations, and he is also the director of the Sheikh Nasser al-Mohammad al-Sabah program in international relations, regional politics, and security at Durham. His work straddles the boundaries of international relations, the dynamics of global regions, and international political economy, and focuses on the role of regional or middle powers, as well as authoritarian systems and convergences between East and West Asia, in which he includes Central Asia and the Middle East. He's going to talk to us about all of those things today. So without any further ado, please, Anoush, take it away. Very excited for this.
Good evening, UK time to you and colleagues. Thank you very much, Bill, for the billing. I think I need to have you write my tombstone as well when that time comes. And also to thank the Center for this invitation. I know this series is a very successful series. You've had some extraordinary speakers. So my only concern is, am I going to lower the tone of the quality of papers you've had? But I think your audience will be best judge of that. And also to apologize to you and colleagues for not being able to be in Cambridge in person. I love Cambridge. I love being there and enjoying all its delights. But alas, my day job has meant that I have to stay here to get on with some mundane bureaucracies that could not be delayed. You've given me about 2 hours to talk, I believe, and given that I'm away from you, there is nothing you can do about it but turning the mic off. So I shall abuse my position and speak for that. No, I'm not. So I'll speak about 45 minutes to look at some of the big picture issues. And as Bill noted, my interest and research kind of straddle boundaries of disciplines, and China for me is the most interesting embodiment of multidisciplinarity in the social sciences, and so I want to just kind of test some of these with you as we go forward. So first and foremost, let me ask the question, why China? To many of us, it's obvious why China, but it's always good to rehearse the reasons why the whole world is focused on China, why we have this series with the Center of Geopolitics, and while there are so many other activities going on with a focus on China and its periphery. The most obvious, of course, is that China is the second largest economy in the world. Why is that important? Why? Because it means that it provides a new anchor, an enormous weight away from the West in creating a whole engine of economic activity for the world. But also, it has got to that point because it's been one of the world's fastest growing economies since the 1990s. You know, we kind of reel off phrases like, oh, China has been growing 10% a year. But to conceptualize what 10% a year for an economy which is already, as it was, in the top 10, is extraordinary historically to be growing at that kind of pace. The newly industrializing countries, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, did that. Singapore did that for a period in the 70s and 80s, but none has been able to sustain the level of development of growth that China has shown. And as a consequence, thirdly, China is now Asia's giant. The displacement weight of China, even when you put it in the context of India, Russia's Asia, and Japan, and so on, it seems to me outweighs a combination of those economies as well. And given that, China is now the world's factory. Literally, you turn any object that you now hold, turn it over, item of clothing you wear, turn it over, and if it's about 5 years old, it will say made in China. Why 5 years old? Because in recent times, even China itself has begun to transfer production off of the mainland for all sorts of value chain debates. But nevertheless, China remains the world's factory. And it's a product, as I'll speak to a bit later, of the growth of the world economy itself. Being the world's factory means that as a consequence, as a direct consequence of that, China is also a massive exporter to the world. But to become an exporter, you also need to import. So it is also one of the world's largest importers as well. In the West, we seem to be sharply focused on the competitive advantage that China has in terms of its trade with the West, with the United States and so on. So we tend to overlook the fact that China is actually also very import dependent. And that is important for China and also for all countries that want to export the raw materials, the semi-processed goods and so on. But also being all of that means that China is also extremely globalization dependent. What that means is that Chinese economy affects the world economy, and what happens in the advanced economies in particular, but also increasingly in the wider trade investment system of the world affects China. This is, if you like, an interdependent relationship that China now finds itself in. But because of what I've said already, because of its weight, its importance, that interdependence is actually not just a simple relationship between China and a particular economy. It is an important factor in the way in which the world economy has been shaping and changing. Also, China is the only country outside of the West which has cultivated a global network of partnerships. All countries have got relationships, all countries have got diplomatic exchanges, but very few, it seems to me, have pushed the boundaries of friendship and relationships with other countries in the way that China has done. And its formula of win-win seems to be winning at friends right across the global south, but also in the global north as well. So the network of partnerships are feeding directly into China's positioning internationally. And China, therefore, is the only country on the planet which is emerging as a peer power of the United States. And that, I would argue, and I would submit, is why so much of debates in Washington and now in European capitals are focusing on the China threat. But I would remind us that we were here before in the 1980s when the Japanese economy was rising dramatically and faster than the European economies and the United States. And even then, the voices from political forces and so on were articulating an argument of the Japanese threat. But it was even more tacky than that, I would argue. And some were talking about this rather foolish phrase of the yellow peril. And that racism is sometimes still kind of is an undercurrent of the fear about China itself. Why is that important? It's important because China is not part of a Western alliance, but is in fact Asia's most important geopolitical power. And I say that without any disrespect to India or Japan or smaller Asian countries. None of them, in my view, compete with China as this giant geopolitical power. But also China's economic success, being a global south country itself, from the global south perspective, is being seen as truly world changing and truly energizing. So, having hopefully provided some background to why China, I just want to unpack some of these issues and look at how did China get here. In many ways, it's the world which has fed China's success, but it's also China's own policies which have got it here. In the year 2000, that is to say, just 1 year before China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it was already bringing in 40% of foreign direct investment going to any part of the global south. It was monopolizing, it was consuming capital at an enormous rate. and in huge quantities as well. So much so that by 2020, and I'm using that benchmark because of the pre-pandemic environment as a better indicator of the importance of the issues, China was contributing 30% a year to global economic growth. 30% a year. China now exports something like $2.5 trillion in goods that are made in China, and that makes China an indispensable economy to the world. 2001 was critical because China joined the World Trade Organization, which, as we see, look at the data, has merely accelerated China's economic development and helped balloon that economy. But it also is important for another reason, and that takes me to the broader global geopolitical issues. And that is, the 2001 was also the September of that year was the tragic terrorist attacks on US soil, what we call 9/11. 9/11 did, what 9/11 did was first help America kind of rethink its position globally. But more fundamentally, what it did was it ended up eroding US's unipolarity, which it had enjoyed from 1991 till 2001, a 10-year period of US dominance. Well, there are very simple ways of explaining that, but there are just four that stick out for me. The first was President Bush's narrative of you're either with us or against us. This had a very polarizing impact on the global South in particular. While the world sympathized with the United States, while the world raised its arms in horror of what was happening in New York, in Washington, and also the tragedy of the plane crash, nevertheless, this narrative of you're either with us or against us helped divide America from some of its traditional or potential allies in the global South. Then followed the Afghan war, which again enjoyed considerable international support. But what they didn't enjoy support was the Iraq war of 2003, which had a very dramatic impact on America itself, on America's policies, its abilities, its military, its economy, but also in terms of its relationship with some of its allies, more specifically, its allies in the MENA region, or what I will call West Asia and North Africa region. What that did was, in fact, cause alienation of Arab allies from America's core message. I know this firsthand, having talked to many of the elite members, particularly in the GCC countries, and the displeasure about the way in which the United States and US politicians were referring to them at the time. You combine China's joining the WTO as a spark of its growing development in 2001 and contrast it with 9/11 and the consequence of that for the United States in 2001 and beyond, then you begin to see the beginnings of a process of change, a change that has accelerated, in my view, thanks to what we now call systemic shift. Systemic shift, for those colleagues who are not familiar with the term, is what we call the process of the weight of the world economy shifting from the North Atlantic, from the Euro-Atlantic area, eastwards, across Europe and into Asia. In fact, if you follow Danny Quah, great professor of economics, who's now in Singapore work, you will see that he actually calculates and plots the center of the world economy. And last time I've looked, it has moved towards eastern part of Iran. So if you wind the clock back to 50 years ago, the center of the world economy was still between the United States, North America, and Europe, moving slightly towards Europe. So this is dramatic change. Systemic shift, in a sense, is underpinning the 2001 phenomena that both China and the United States have been experiencing. But for the purpose of our talk tonight, systemic shift is actually, in my view, about what I call Asianization of Asia. People say, Anoush, Asia is always there. You know, what are you talking about? What I'm talking about is the rediscovery of parts of Asia, of other parts of Asia. It's, in a sense, you know, regionalization gone ballistic, where you begin to see the patterns of trade, economic activity move away from the West, Europe, United States in particular, and move further and further eastwards, but also focusing towards Asia. So we now have this notion of pivot to Asia. Virtually every country around the Mediterranean, in the Middle East and Arab region has got a look east policy. Even dare I say, India has a look east policy, even though India in many ways sits at the very heart of the Asian continent. Asianization is important in the context of what I've said already, because it is the defining factor or the defining notion that helps us understand what modern 21st century inter-Asian relations mean. This is not about the ancient Silk Road, but the ancient Silk Road helps shape awareness, if you like, of perception, of roles, and so on, in rejuvenating the relationships which are severed due to European colonialism entering Asia some 5 centuries ago. And Asianization also leads towards an economic pivot towards China inevitably. But it's not just about China. It also includes India. It also includes Japan. It also includes Republic of Korea. It also includes Taiwan, Hong Kong, so long as it operates as an autonomous economic region in its own right, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, I should mention for the record, is a thriving part of Asia, and its economies are heavily integrated with the big four: India, China, Republic of Korea, and Japan. But amongst those, China is the pivot around which they turn. Talking of pivot, Bill, let me now have a look at China's pivot westwards. While the rest of the world is rushing eastwards, it's interesting that China has also developed this westwards pivot of its own. And I would argue that the roots of this, and China's relations with West Asia and the Arab region, as you know, have a long history. And you know well, Bill, given your own research and your own writings, but you know, at the heart of the Cold War, China was not isolated from this region. Whether it was the non-aligned movement, whether it was its own interactions with nationalist, pan-Arabist, leftists, pro-Chinese communist parties, and so on, China has had a presence in this region, no question. But something has changed. Something has changed in the 21st century, and the lifting of the Cold War curtain, and also the emergence of a non-unipolar world. Let's not call it bipolar, multipolar yet. And the pivot, the roots of the modern era pivot, I would argue, putting the Cold War and the historical relations aside, for me begins when China becomes a net importer of oil, in particular in 1993. This is like a wake-up call. The alarm bells begin to ring, and China begins to realize that it now has to be dependent more and more on the literal fuel that keeps that engine of growth going. Why is that? Because China's economic development, as we all know, its industrialization followed the same classic pattern of Europe, United States, Japan, the NICs, and now China. And it is immensely energy intensive. And until climate change came along, and until affordable renewable energy came along, the fuel of choice for industrial development was oil. In more recent time, it's natural gas, but it was oil which drove the West's economies, and it was oil that kicked off China's. It was oil that kept Japan's going, still does in many ways. And for China, therefore, 1993 is the pivotal moment in which it has to begin to replace the deck chairs on its ship and reorder some of its priorities. Post-Cold War, therefore, China does begin to venture westwards into Central Asia. There is no longer Soviet Union to barricade Central Asia from others. South Asia, its relations with Pakistan were good during the Cold War, but have blossomed in the Cold War, post-Cold War period, particularly after China's development of Pakistan's development of nuclear weapons, when the United States reluctantly, in many ways, pulled its military support back from Pakistan, and that was the golden moment for this beautiful friendship that we now see between Pakistan and the People's Republic. Very important pivot for China's South Asia presence is Pakistan, which of course does not please India one bit, for reasons that we can talk about in Q&A if you wish. China has ventured beyond these two places into Southeast Asia, which is in many ways around China Sea's backyard, but also into West Asia, into the Persian Gulf, in search of resources, not just oil, but broader resources. Remember what I said earlier about China's huge import dependency on so many raw materials. So from the late 2000s, I would say from the beginning of the 2010s, China begins the search for new markets for its fast-growing exports beyond the West, begins to look at other lucrative Asian markets, African markets, and slowly but surely Latin America. And now suddenly there is all this talk of China is moving into America's backyard in Latin America. Well, actually, China's been there for some time. You know, Brazil, for example, is China's key trading partner in Latin America. And it's been growing and is now very significant in terms of the bilateral economic relations. But it is Central Asia and West Asia that emerge as the key providers of raw materials and fuel for China. That explains partly this pivot westwards. And then, of course, there is connectivity, the buzzword in China, and the means through which China aims to integrate the political economy of Eurasia around its own hub. And we have the Silk Road, we have the new Silk Road, we have OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiative, but all of that fade into insignificance in 2013, when President Xi Jinping launches the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is now the dominant driver of much of China's political economy, foreign policy approaches. BRI, I would say, is Eurasia changing in so many ways, and is also an indication of China's readiness to stamp its own authority on the political economy of development Eurasia, but also when it goes into Africa, when it comes into Europe, well beyond just those boundaries. I've used the term Asianization already to depict this Pan-Asian growth model, and also to partly explain China's pivot westwards. Let me now drill down a bit and get to brass tacks of Asianization. I argue that Asianization has accelerated since the mid-2000s for the reasons that I've already highlighted. And China today is leading Asianization, but also other countries like India, like Japan, like Korea, like Singapore and so on, are benefiting from China charging ahead in terms of interactions with West Asia and other parts of Asia, partly hanging onto China's coattails, but partly following on the openings that China manages in these parts of the world for their own increasing market share. So where China goes, or where Japan have been, China goes, and you can see these multi-levels of Asianization taking place. Korean companies build infrastructure in UAE, Chinese companies go and provide rolling stock for some of them. Japan does other high-tech provisions for these countries. It is increasingly integrated, is what I mean by this, and argue that the process has accelerated since the mid-2000s. And What that means in practical terms, you can, in a sense, not so much quantify, but you can do. I've done it in some of my writings, but you can begin to conceptualize this Asianization along 6 axes. What are these axes? The first one, and in many ways still the key driver, is energy trade. But increasingly in the last 10 years is energy and oil-related investments. You know, drilling down to petrochemicals, building refineries in China by Gulf money and vice versa. These are helping to integrate the regions and China's involvement here. Where energy trade is, others trades follow. So secondly, we see that on the back of this massive energy trade, there is non-energy trade investment. If you look at the earlier patterns of Asianization, inter-Asian relations, when Japan and South Korea in particular, and Singapore, were at the height of their economic development, and when oil prices began to rocket from 1974 onwards, those countries had no choice but to start paying from $2.50 a barrel to $30 a barrel, by $79, $100 a barrel for their oil imports, on which they were almost entirely dependent from OPEC and West Asia, and a bit from Indonesia and Malaysia. Their response mechanism was to increase their exports to these same markets. Some of them were cash rich: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Emirates. In those days, Oman and Bahrain too. Iran, very much so, were cash rich. And so to compensate for this massive spike in prices in oil imports, because their oil consumption didn't necessarily increase, was to push their exports to these markets. China has gone down the same route. On the back of its huge the amount of money that it spends on oil imports, it needs to compensate for it, partly by getting its non-energy trade and investments up and into these same markets, and many of which, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, like Qatar, like Kuwait, are still cash rich, but also ambitious, which suits China to the T. The third axis at which we can look is military and security relations. If you look at the patterns of, if you like, oil economy, you'll see from the 1930s, 40s, when the United States becomes very conscious of Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, and after the Second World War, the strategy of securing these supplies from the Soviet Union and during the war and before it from the Axis, Germany and so on, was to create broader military and security partnerships. So much so that the United States emerged and remains the dominant military power in West Asia. Well, China too has security concerns about the supply chains of its energy imports from here, and is increasingly looking at developing military and security relationships, not to substitute or compensate, if you like, in many ways what the United States does, far from it, but also to have its own, if you like, security partnership with these states. And this is the strongest you will see with Iran. There are good reasons for that. Again, that we can discuss in Q&A if you wish. The fourth axis along which we can explore this Asianization is the diplomatic exchanges which China has been involved with. And we can argue this goes back a long way, but for our purposes, to 2005 and China's production of this Arab policy paper, which you haven't looked at it, do look at it, because it's very enlightening in terms of where China positioned itself with these countries, but also the way in which the Arab states have responded to China's call and approach to them. But alongside that, China has also pursued what it calls comprehensive strategic partnerships. These are the most valued partners, if you like, that China has. And it's a badge of honor that it gives to such countries as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE in West Asia as its comprehensive strategic partners. But what is interesting is that China doesn't determine these according to their weight geographically. UAE is tiny compared to Iran and Saudi Arabia, and yet UAE is perhaps the most important economic partner that China has in West Asia. So the badge of comprehensive partnership is a significant indicator of where China puts its weight. But also it has what it calls strategic partnerships, which are much broader. They don't go to the same level of detail, but nevertheless, they are again a reminder to those countries that China values their relationship with them and takes them seriously. An example of this comprehensive partnership, of course, was the 25-year China-Iran deal that was signed a couple of years ago, that again, Bill has written about extensively and has commented on, so he can tell us more about it than I at the moment. But nevertheless, that is an important, not just economic, but also diplomatic indicator of China's positioning and the value that it gives to these relationships. But if that wasn't enough, just last November 2022, when President Xi Jinping led a high-level delegation to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia, it had two very important summits. One was the China GCC summit, which Saudi China chaired, and then there was the China Arab summit on the back of it, both of which were very significant indicators of the importance that China is putting, the value it's putting on diplomatic exchanges with countries of the region. Following these things, of course, is fifthly, people-to-people exchanges. Chinese tourists like going to the region. The people in this region are beginning to discover China in its extraordinary natural beauty and its deep, deep culture and civilization. And so where governments show willing, where they see on their televisions, in their media, a blessed endorsement of relationship across Asia in this manner, people naturally follow. Tours naturally follow. And there is growing people-to-people exchanges between China and West Asia. But also, these are being underpinned by broader cultural and educational exchanges. The Confucian Institutes, for example, which are mushrooming in this part of the world, are really important. The fact that China now can show off its universities' linguistic capabilities by sending fluent diplomats to this part of the fluent speakers to this part of the world, and also by encouraging these countries to develop Mandarin, for example, within their curriculum. Even in the UAE now, beginning to look at whether they should be teaching Mandarin at school, are significant indicators of Asianization, and that is the sixth axis that we need to look at. So if that captures kind of the dynamics of Asianization in the way that I see it, I'd now like to move on and look at some of the key factors which are driving China's westward pivot, many of which I've already talked about, but I just want to labor some of them for purpose of clarification, but also to be able to kind of integrate some of my random thoughts into a coherent narrative. As I've said already, the first is energy, particularly in the context of energy transition elsewhere today. What does that mean? First, that the US is no longer dependent on Middle East oil for its economic development or its economic growth or economic activity. It needs those prices to be stable, that is for sure, but fracking in the United States in many ways has revolutionized the American energy market. And China is very conscious of that, because it can see that the United States is no longer an importer, but also a net exporter of natural gas. In fact, at the height of the European energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was partly the United States that was exporting liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe to plug some of the holes that were there arising from Europeans cutting back their imports from Russia. That's one, that what was the biggest oil market for West Asia has more or less disappeared. The second is Japan and Republic of Korea also have either been reducing their oil imports from this region or stabilizing it as best they can. So in a sense, you could argue that those are, for the exporters, a saturated market. There isn't a growth potential. The growth lies in China and in India, which is also growing fast, as you know. And the third reason why the energy transition is important in my discussion of the pivot is Europe has been looking for its Russia fix following the invasion of Ukraine, and it has done two things. First, it has been trying to flatline demand. It has tried to cap it as best it can. You know, those of us who live in Europe, in UK in particular, we know that the government was advising us to lower our thermostats in winter to 19 degrees, for example, to heat only rooms that we occupy, to make sure windows are shut, to make sure we don't use light unnecessarily, and so on. These were essentially to flatline demand as best as European governments could, but also to accelerate the pace of energy diversification, which is being pushed forward because of climate change. So the COP meetings, COP26 in particular, has set very strict deadlines and targets for climate change control, and Europe has embraced it as wholly as it can, partly in response to having to get its Russia fix sorted. So that's energy as one bit. The next is markets. China's pivot this way, westwards, is important because it now finds itself in the enviable position of being the supreme partner, economic partner of all the GCC countries, as well as Iran, as well as Iraq. Basically, the oil hub of the world is now looking east, and China is therefore looking west. This offers China unique opportunities to consolidate its position and build on this early energy trade to become the economic pole for these countries for decades to come. And what that gives China also is, of course, opportunities. Thirdly, China's westward pivot can be explained by its desire for accessibility. Supply routes are vital for China's economic growth, but also for its economic stability and security. China wants to make sure that routes are stable and secure. It cannot afford to have these disrupted. The Malaga Straits is a nightmare. Strait of Hormuz is another nightmare. The Suez Canal, Bab al-Mandab are all choke points that China is now perhaps most dependent on for its prosperity going forward. So connectivity is important. And it is in this context that I take us back to my discussions of the Belt and Road Initiative as connectivity par excellence for China. BRI is a transit notion, strategy, but is also a destination strategy for China. And here in West Asia, it acts as both of these things. It provides a transit for BRI into East Africa from Saudi Arabia, into Mediterranean through the UAE and ultimately Israel, and into Europe through Iran and Turkey, and also through Central Europe, now that Russia is a black hole and Ukraine is closed off. A route between Russia southwards through Iran, out of the Persian Gulf and into Indian Ocean and eastwards there. Connectivity is central to China's strategy. And this helps it, fifthly, to consolidate its presence in key markets, but also where it is dependent on supply of raw materials and inputs in particular. At the geostrategic level also, China needs this westward pivot because it's very conscious of what economists call the middle income trap, that it needs to grow and not be static, not remain as this size economy, but also to avoid stagnation, stagflation that Japan suffered from, and many would argue suffered from the 80s, 90s, and has never really recovered from that crisis since. China needs to find ways of outgrowing the middle income trap and not become stagnant economy. And West Asia, other parts of Asia, provide it with the basic essentials that can help it continue to move forward, but also it tries to secure the supply chains as well as the value chains that China is now so dependent on and which are being threatened by the United States in particular as a direct consequence of the rising tensions with China, but also Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Secondly, I've mentioned the supply chains, but this is important because China needs to sustain its growth rate. It's not going to be 10%, 11% any longer, but it needs to keep at least 4% a year growth rate to make sure that it can maintain if you like, an edge of growing prosperity and development. China still sees itself as a developing economy, and its people see it as a developing economy, albeit an outgrown global actor as well, because the Chinese Communist Party has promised endless prosperity for its people. It has lifted 200 million Chinese out of poverty, but that's not all, because there are many other millions who are waiting. There are rural areas that need development. There are all these young Chinese, highly educated, that need jobs. So China needs to maintain a growth development model to maintain itself. So there are internal reasons for it as well. But also, China needs this westward pivot because it needs to grow its influence in places where it may have been thus far absent or weak. And last but not least, China is very conscious of the geopolitical competition that it now finds itself with the United States. There are huge debates, Bill, that again, we may or may not engage with in terms of whether China is a rogue actor, is a state revisionist global power. It wants to create a new international order in competition with the Westphalian system and so on, a Bretton Woods system. We can debate all of these. Why do these countries regard China as a partner? Why is it a partner? First, China does not have colonial baggage. It doesn't have a colonial legacy, at least in this part of the world. We know that in relation to Korea, further south, further east into Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet, and so on, China has a very mixed record of political presence. Nevertheless, here at least, in this part of the world, it doesn't suffer from a colonial legacy. So therefore, if you like, it has a clean slate. And also, it doesn't have any prejudices towards authoritarian regimes. It takes them as they come. In fact, it's very comfortable with them. It's conscious of the instabilities that non-Chinese type of authoritarian order bring. It watched the Arab world, the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, and how they shifted power so dramatically and rapidly in the Arab region. But nevertheless, it has no prejudices towards authoritarianism, unlike the West, who are, if you like, dictators. That is to say, they dictate terms of you must democratize, you must liberalize, you must have better human rights records, and so on. China doesn't do diktats of that nature. It is its mantra: we don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. But also, China is happy to position itself as an honest broker. And its success in that regard has been shown this year, since March of this year, in fact, when we've seen the fruits of China's diplomatic exchanges with Iran and Saudi Arabia to try and restore relations between these two countries after half a decade or so of hiatus. China didn't do the heavy lifting that was done by Oman, by Iraq. Even the United States had been pushing the Saudis to try and come to terms with Iran because it really wasn't good for the regional stability. But nevertheless, it was China that got them to sign the deal, and it has in many ways has been the patron of the deal which now exists. So China likes this image of itself as an honest broker, and these countries are putting praise on China for the role that it has played. China prides itself also on having open relations with virtually every West Asian and North African country. When you look at the United States, of course, the United States doesn't. Certainly not with one of the key players, and that is to say, Iran. China says, I'm friends with all of you. And also for these countries, they see China, and when you speak to the elite, they say, literally, China is one of us. China was from our world, which has managed to climb this ladder, the hierarchy of power, so rapidly, but it doesn't owe anything to the West. It has done it by itself and now it stands on its 2 feet. We are proud of China. It is one of us which has managed to break out of the constraints that we find ourselves within. They therefore like China becoming an emerging superpower. They like China, furthermore, as an emerging superpower, which stands up to the United States and the West and provides, at least indirectly, shelter for them from American or European pressure on them. And some of them fancy the idea of China is creating a new world order, which might be different and probably better than what the West has put in front of us so far. But let me end with a note of caution. Resurgence of China is not equal to demise of the West. I would argue that the US and the West more generally are not necessarily declining. China's relative growth is faster than theirs, and their position in the world economy as we have it now for the rest of the century, it remains solid. The United States is not going to go away unless a Trump 2.0 comes up, which follows an isolationist strategy and also a disastrous foreign policy that severs America's position globally. The United States, in my view, is a rebalancer, not a lever of regions. If anything, it is very conscious that to maintain its position in East Asia, it needs to make sure that West Asia is stable, and that given China's dependence on West Asia and the Persian Gulf, it cannot afford to abandon its own position in that part of the world in terms of leverage over China. Also, China is very conscious that it benefits from American security umbrella and American security presence in this part of the world because, you know, it's a free rider in that regard. The Americans are paying the price of this in treasure and in blood, and why should they complain about it? And also, China is not, let's say, yet, exclamation mark, an anti-status quo power. China says openly that it has no desire to change the international system. It's very interested in making it more democratic, using Chinese vernacular. China is not a changer, but is in search of balance. And it's for these reasons, Bill, I'll finish now, that China's westward pivot is so fundamental, because China is now encroaching on territories that for 200 years were the playground of Europe and the United States. The West is not familiar with a new power emerging. It was used to the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War, but with that gone, China is a very different creature with which they have to come to terms with. But the issue is that the regional countries have already settled that score and are looking east to China as their main economic and going forward political partner as well. I've already spoke far too long, so let me stop there and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anoush, for an incredibly wide-ranging and fascinating talk. So I'm going to use my prerogative as the host to ask a question, make a comment or two of my own. I would also just encourage anybody in the audience who has a question, feel free to send it to the question and answer system, or send it to me in a comment, and we can go ahead and ask them, questions from the audience as we go through. Pardon me. So I was really interested. You brought up, the sort of Cold War era that we've both sort of written about. The Cold. I was thinking about how during the Cold War, China's interest in the Middle East was much more strategic in some ways, in the sense that it viewed, or maybe not strategic, but more security based, in the sense that it viewed the Cold War as the sort of intermediate zone that any kind of global conflict, the sort of which that Mao was constantly predicting would happen, would center over. And this was because of the West's dependency on oil, right? That if there was a conflict, then it would be necessary to sort of cut off the supply of oil to the West. And as you identified, in the 90s, when China became a net oil importer, it sort of changed that relationship. And now it wants to have a deeper and more constructive relationship and its own kind of security interactions. And it's not just just in the Middle East, this oil dependency.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia provides the highest contribution of oil, around like 15%, but Brazil and Russia are also high on the list. But it is most of the top partners, I think the top 6 or so, are all in the Gulf. So the Middle East overall is critical, even though the sources are diverse. So I was just to start with, I would love to hear more on your thoughts of, sort of how oil politics plays into the relationships that we're seeing. If there's anything else that you wanted to add to
that. Gladly, absolutely, Bill. I mean, my view is that crude oil, has shaped so much of China's perception of this region. You're right. At the height of the Cold War, and it was actually during its anti-Soviet era that the Chinese were so focused on this region, because if the paper tiger no longer mattered, what they needed to do was to begin to kind of compete with the Soviet Union, but also create their own presence through popular fronts and small communist parties to let Maoism spread, whether it is Oman, whether it is Yemen, whether it is Iran. Maoist groups began to grow, and so it was China's own inter-communist Cold War that was shaping much of what it was doing in this region, not the Cold War that we are familiar with between the Soviets and the United States, between the East and the West. And in the post-Cold War period, in many ways, I think China has become much more, and remember, so China becomes oil import dependent barely 2 years after the end of the Cold War, right? I would like us to think about what would have happened if the Soviet Union had not collapsed and the Cold War persisted, when China had become much more oil dependent for its economic development in the 1990s. What would the United States have done in that context? My view is it would have helped China as best it could have, because in the 1990s, China was still very much seen as a subservient Asian power, not a threat, not a rival, and a good poke in the eye of the Soviets. So great, let's make sure that the Chinese have access to this at our largesse, and so on. And even more interestingly, what would have been China's response to its growing oil import dependency? How will they have engaged in a discussion? You've written very much about Chinese-Iranian relations during the Pahlavi era, and so on. It was warm. China's relations with Kuwait were open. China's relations with Oman were present. So China would probably accelerate these bilateral partnerships. Tactically, not strategically, because it would have had to be conscious of the Soviet Union and the United States and that war going on as well. But it would have been, its mindset would have been being more dependent on the American world order at that time. But with the Cold War gone, I think it in many ways liberated strategic thinking in Beijing. They could now look at Asia, not dominated by the Soviet Union, but as open landmass for exchanges. And the Chinese moving from 95 onwards very quickly to build these bilateral relationships. It's no surprise that Kazakhstan has got such close links in China, because it started very soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. And so I would argue that China's strategic rigor has evolved over time and has been helped by these global changes, by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the end of the Cold War, and the acceleration of China's own economic development following its joining of the WTO. But as I implied earlier, China's development in the 1990s was already phenomenal. Yeah, World Trade Organization helped it consolidate and regularize its economic growth and development, right? It opened it up to, if you like, global standards that brought even more investment into the country and accelerated that pace of growth even more. And as did, in fact, China's oil import needs. You know, as China grew, you know, you can plot the growth figure against oil imports, and you can see there's a direct correlation between the two. And so in that sense, China is the world's leading renewable energy thinker and provider, for good reasons, because it knows how bad climate change is for it and for its partners, and also because China wants to begin to wean itself off of oil dependence, oil import dependence. It's going to take time, and for the next 30 years, I would argue, and we know that it's still growing, for the next 30 years, while it looks at India, which is also going to increase imports from the same pool of resources, China will have to look at this part of the world in the same strategic way as the United States did in the 20th century.
Absolutely. So I want to turn. I'd love to talk about, you know, my interest in Maoism and all that all day. But let's turn to the questions from the audience. You know, and we can always go back to things later if we want. So somebody asked about the potential for strategic convergence between the U.S. and China's competing interests in the MENA region, specifically with regards to the Belt and Road. They were wondering if you see this as a sort of geopolitical pivot upon which perhaps conflict can be avoided in the South China Sea. For example, if China can prosper through the Belt and Road, would it be less likely to risk war in that region?
Gosh, that's a very, very interesting question. Thank you for that. I wrote last year in PRISM, which is the journal of the National Defense University in Washington, a paper that the audience can download free of charge. Paper called "The BRI and Its Rivals," and I argue that the BRI has actually acted as a catalyst for China's competitors to wake up to the significance of the BRI and to the importance of BRI to China's strategy, but also to the rest of the world. That it's not something that they can neglect any longer. That it is now literally being woven, sewn into the fabric of Asian countries, and that as such they are waking up to it. So Japan and India have a partnership. India is now talking about its own kind of infrastructure initiative that will go through Iran, as you know, into Central Asia, that will go westwards to Israel, into Europe, and so on. The Japanese have done the same, and of course we know from the G7 Build Back Better initiative are all responses to the BRI. I would argue that they're all late. They've all missed the boat. That what China has put in place is far more strategic, profound, and properly supported by this. It's true that China's investments in the BRI projects have diminished since the pandemic, but also following the pandemic, they're being scaled back for all sorts of good reasons. But China is not going to be investing $100 billion a year, every year in BRI projects, right? Which leaves room open for what our colleague has talked in terms of strategic convergence, because China's competitors, I hate the words competitors and rivals, other countries around China will see the BRI less of an overwhelming threat if China cuts back on some of its big initiatives. And India won't see it as, okay, maybe we should kind of piggyback on it, not for a while, but for the United States and for Japan even. Japan has never come out opposing the BRI. To be fair, the Americans have never come out opposing the BRI. They have said that it's corrupt, it's inefficient, it is opaque, and so on. And they want a bit more transparency, rule of law, international system regulation, and so on. But that provides a window for a dialogue around connectivity around the world, because the UN estimates that for the world to develop, it needs better infrastructure, and that is going to cost it anything between 15 to 30 trillion dollars. Who is going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for that? China is trying to do some of the heavy lifting, but for that convergence to take place, though, I think they need to come to some understanding in West Asia, but from China's perspective, in particular, around Sea of Japan and in South China Sea. China now has put its national interest around those geographies, and it sees America as a direct threat to its national security in that context. And that, for me, closes the window on strategic convergence, while these two countries actually don't have a dialogue about those broader security issues that China is very much concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you made at the end there. It's the broader security issues that are really continue to be an issue there. You brought up another thing that I was really interested in myself. The sort of slowdown of the BRI, and like you said, China's not going to continue to invest hundreds of billions of dollars every year. I think about some of my own work on the 25-year agreement in Iran that you discussed, which is has this kind of narrative in the media of, I think the number that gets quoted all the time is $400 billion is going to be invested over the next 25 years. This is something that I've sort of debunked a few times in the press. But I was curious what you thought about Iran-China relations in general, because you sort of brought it up as sort of another example of the importance that China puts on this region, even in the face of U.S. sanctions, and that's absolutely true. And it's also very, very true, as you pointed out, that China is extraordinarily focused on and heavily investing in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE especially. But from my perspective, I actually see the sort of investment in Iran lagging behind fairly substantially, as sort of like an example of kind of an outlier, maybe a sort of an exception that proves the rule in some ways. So I was just curious what you thought about that. Yeah. Good question, Bill. I think Iran is the last El Dorado in this part of the world. Population of 85 million and ticking up, highly educated, in spite of the shortcomings of the Islamic Republic, endowed with enormous natural resources. We talk about oil, but oil is the tip of the iceberg. Iran is holding, second largest reserves of natural gas. It's done sod all with it,
you look at Qatar and Iran, you can see where the lead is in what Qatar has done over the last 20 years. You could argue, yeah, Iran has been shooting itself in the foot time and time again with sanctions and what have you. But, when oil is out of fashion, natural gas is not going to go away for a long time. And Iran sits on that huge reserve. It has minerals that can match Russian mineral deposits. It sits at the very edge of Southwest Asia that connects it to Arabian Peninsula, to Turkey, and to Caucasus and Central Asia, all at the same time. No other country in that part of the world has got that kind of geographic reach. And that is important for China as well. But also the ideological dimension is really important. Let me put a footnote around that. Of course, that ideological proximity was challenged in January when we saw the press briefs coming out of President Xi Jinping's trip to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh. When you read the text of the communiques, it could have been written in the United States, in how it depicted Iran, in how it talked about the 3 islands. It talked about nuclear proliferation and so on. And as you know, Bill, you've written about this, it upset Iranians hugely. And the Chinese had to backtrack, had to massage, had to go and kind of try and rebuild that order. So we talk about this ideological convergence, but it's obviously full of pitfalls. The only place where this ideological convergence works is in relation to America's Iran's anti-hegemonic worldview and its continuing diatribe against the United States and seeing America as this existential threat. I mean, if China needed a bogeyman in West Asia, it would have had to create something that looks like the Islamic Republic, right? So it's there. It's there. It doesn't challenge China on anything. China can do what it likes to its Muslim population, and Iranian lips are zipped on that. China cannot do any wrong when it comes to superpower rivalries. But also, China is the model for fulfillment of Iran's look east policy that has been around since 2005, if not before then. That suddenly now, the narrative of China being this economic giant, China being peer power against the United States, is all music to the ears of Iran's gray men elite, as I call them. This is the fulfillment of their ambition that somebody else is finally coming in our neighborhood to stand against Americans. Yeah, China has got our back. Well, with caveats, given the communiques that were released. And so for China to have that kind of love, thrown at it is great. But Iran remains closed El Dorado as far as China is concerned. And the little opening that we saw following the signing of the JCPOA, 2016, 2017, we saw Iran open its doors to Europe and not to China, right? Even though President Xi Jinping had been there in January of 2016, it was European companies that were Mercedes, Airbus, Renault, Peugeot, BP, Eni, Shell, you name it. They were there. China was there, but it was really quite telling how rapidly it opened up to Europe. And of course, America was still stupidly cutting his hand off of Iran. And so it left the field wide open for European businesses to explore El Dorado. When the shutters came down with Trump, Iran had nowhere to go but back to China, right? And China knows this. China knows Iran is this, what Americans call this low-hanging fruit that is waiting. China doesn't have to do anything. because once sanctions are lifted, it can do whatever it wants, because it has that 25-year agreement in place, and because it knows that Iran once bitten, twice shy when it comes to the West. And it will, and China is now rapidly deepening these relationships. And it knows that it can then take advantage of El Dorado when sanctions are lifted. So going back to convergence that colleague had raised earlier, obviously, China and the United States have a common interest in the resurrection of the JCPOA. America wants this thing taken off its back. China wants this done because it can get into the Iranian market fully and properly. And in the meanwhile, Iranians are in many ways sitting ducks. They've got nowhere to go. So China can continue cultivating its deepening economic relations with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, and so on, by long-term gas agreements with Qatar, for goodness sake, that they did just 2 months ago at Iran's expense, because it's coming from the shared gas field, and there is virtually nothing that Iran can do about it, right? So, you know, those Iran-China relations, in a sense, are now locked in an asymmetry that many in Iran actually are unhappy about and are very afraid of, because they see that Iran doesn't have a winning hand against China. And those debates, go do the circles, you know, go to clubhouse debates, and you'll see how vibrant these debates are. And also, we know from the previous Rouhani government that they are alive in elite circles as well, right? So I would say many would see Iran-China relations in transition. I see it in stagnation for the moment. But it doesn't mean that the relations are not ready to flourish going forward.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with the way that you put it at the end there. It's very much in stagnation. It's a good way to put it. So I want to talk about something a little more sort of building off of the earlier point on convergence, and talk about kind of big picture things. So someone asked about the concept you raised about systemic shift. If you could talk a little bit more about that. And in particular, they were interested in whether we should still think in terms of cores and peripheries, perhaps more in terms of expansive and unequal networks of production or distribution. And they also were curious about what authors we should read to learn about this concept. And yeah.
Fabulous, fabulous. You know, Bill, there is nothing to it. I've got to come and spend about 4 days in Cambridge to talk through all of this with you guys. So systemic shift is so for the last 200 years we have become accustomed to the capitalist world order, which grew out of Europe, where Britain became the dominant, if you like, industrial power of the 19th century, and other European countries, Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, and so on, followed suit. And then that same process grew dramatically in the United States because of European, you know, when you look at European investments, United States still the biggest market, right? So Europe actually built the American economy. And that money poured into United States, and United States with huge geography, economy, growing population. But also the trick in the US, of course, in the 19th century was bringing in skilled labor, opening its doors to migrants from Europe who were escaping prosecution and persecution and hunger, but had skills and were thirsty for work and so on. And you know, from late 19th century, we see early 20th century, it's the American takeoff period. And once the Great Depression out of the way in early 20th century, America becomes unstoppable. And on the back of the Second World War, where virtually all of Europe is in ruins, America takes the reins and its economy grows in the way that we've seen and becomes the world's largest economy. they created the system. Yeah, well, Europe created a system post World War II, put all the bells and whistles on it, and the American United States became the guarantor of that system, right? That's what we call the international economic order. Systemic shift happens when the dimensions and the boundaries of that order begin to change. So the process, and for a long time it was no process. If you look at much of the 20th century, much of world trade is across the Atlantic. Much of global investment is across the Atlantic. That was the pivot of the world economy. It was actually not a world economy. It was a Euro-Atlantic economy for a very long time. When that began to change, and it began to change thanks to the end of the Cold War, thanks to the rapid development of globalization, thanks to stagflation in the West in the 1970s, which is a really important period, when the end of the dollar, if you like, the gold standard, very significant, where currencies became permeable and so on. And when in the end, the Cold War ended, that this process, which was already in evidence, and you can pinpoint it to the rise of the newly industrialized countries of Brazil, of Chile, of Argentina, of Republic of Korea, of Taiwan, of Singapore, of Thailand, and so on. They, from the 70s, began to show the cracks in the system that the West had dominated. Why? Because, and this speaks to the second question as well, Bill, because the semi-periphery, as it were, was now emerging in its own right. It was no longer this core periphery relationship in the national system, but rather a growing semi-periphery, a new cushion. This new cushion of growing industrialization in parts of the global South was augmented by what the UN, the World Bank at the time, called the capital surplus countries. Until the 1970s, the world had never seen this idea of a capital surplus, right? What does that mean? What the World Bank meant by capital surplus is that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and to a lesser extent Iran, had so much money that they could not absorb that capital any longer, right? They also had broken out of that core periphery relationship. They were now, if you like, in many ways, what the Saudis now call in a status of strategic autonomy, right? They had entered the semi-periphery as a different kind of economy, not industrial economies, but as monopolies of a strategic raw material, of oil, of crude oil. Systemic shift accelerated from that position when the barriers came down, but also when at the same time, China began its rise. So, these are not coincidences. When you start joining the dots, you can see that there are very clear international political economy patterns for these developments, right? And it's when the Iron Curtain is lifted that globalization accelerates, that investment pours into China, and that China begins its weight, its height begins to grow. And it is then that the world economy, the power of purchasing, if you like, the power of that economic ball begins to shift eastwards. This is what we mean by systemic shift. And that shift started then and has continued and has accelerated because the West has stagnated. It has not grown as fast as India and China. And so long as they continue to grow faster than the West, then that shift will continue, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And the other colleague is right in terms of center periphery. Yeah, I think, but I wouldn't throw away the radical political economy literature that quickly though, because in some ways you could begin to raise questions about where China sits in all of this. I glibly referred to this when I talked about the middle income trap, because of course the issue is, so which world does China sit in? Is it part of the center by virtue of the weight of its economy, by virtue of the interdependencies that it has, and also by the way that it now exploits natural resources from the global south in ways that its predecessors did? Or is it part of the semi-periphery, which is trying to continue to climb up the ladder of development, is much higher than any of the other semi-peripheries because of its demography, geography, economic size, and so on, but is nevertheless still within that category of the middle income category? And can it break through, or is China now complicit in maintaining the same order that keeps the global north intact? I'm raising these questions because I'm grappling with them in my own mind, and I think that person who asked the question should now grab the head of this thread from me and follow it and explore these debates.
Great, great. I know that you'll like this next question because I've seen your Twitter feed and I know you have a lot of thoughts about this subject. But someone wants to know, do you consider that the longer that the war in Ukraine continues, it's more and more within China's interest to want it to come to an end? And do you see any kind of cleavage or rupture between China and Russia in terms of its recent proposal to mediate between the conflicts?
Yeah, you're damn right. I'm very on this. Those who don't know, I stand squarely against Russia's aggression, and I despise those who apply relativism to compare what Russia has done to Ukraine in terms of what the West has done to other countries. Relativism is in many ways a mental disease, in my view. Let me be really blunt. You cannot justify an aggression of this sort by looking at what other countries have done elsewhere. They're all bad, but this is the one that we're currently grappling with. And in that regard, I stand squarely with the Ukrainians, and I feel their pain every day when I wake up to yet more missile attacks on their civilian populations, and when I see pictures of the destruction that Russia has wrought on innocent Ukraine. Where China comes in is very interesting, because of course Putin launched this war a month after Friendship with No Limits was announced in the embrace of Putin and Xi Jinping. And then China found itself in a pickle, and I think that pickle, if anything, has got even more sour, because the early victory that they might have expected from Russia, or that Putin had anticipated from his own generals, has not happened. But if anything, Russia's military campaign has now become a textbook of defeat in ways that in Britain they look at Napoleon's defeats, in the way that we look at Hitler's defeats. You know, this is now a strategic blunder on a global scale. And in that sense, it does leave China vulnerable to its own self-position, its own position and its relations with Russia. China finds it very difficult to review policies that it has already announced and do a kind of a U-turn on them. So it finds itself in a strategic, but also in a conceptual dilemma, that how do I deal with this? And so the 12-point peace plan is perhaps a very limp response to the gravity of the situation. But nevertheless, it is indicative of China saying, you know what, maybe we need to talk about this. Maybe, you know, an all-out victory by Russia. And that is the subtext of this, of course, to our plan, is unlikely. And so let's see where we can begin to draw some boundaries for dialogue. And of course, typically Putin, Russia says, yes, let's do it. And because the 12-point plan does not condemn Russia for aggression, nor does it talk about withdrawal of forces from occupied land. And so from Ukraine's perspective, what's in it for us, mate? You know, and going back to China being an honest broker, which is an example of where it doesn't come across necessarily as an honest broker. It becomes across as a biased actor. Russia is concerned about this, not only in terms of its bilateral relations with Russia, because while weaker Russia leaves Asia open for China, while weaker Russia will become more dependent on China, the last thing China would need is a long tail in its competition with the United States. It does not want to be carrying baggage. And Russia going forward is going to be a lemon case, guys. Russia is not going to be a prosperous, thriving state. It's going to be a miserable place for the Russians for some time to come. And China will have to bail them out if this continues the way it does. That's one. The second is, for me, Russia's aggression has soured relations that China had built with Europe. You remember, it was only last year that China became Europe's largest trading partner. Hooray, let's celebrate. Let's build on this. Let's bring BRI to the heart of Germany and so on. Let's continue to build relations with Greece, with Hungary, with Italy, with France, with the Balkans and so on. Russia's war has in so many ways jeopardized much of this. And the fact that Europe is now close to the United States, that at any time, President Macron's comments notwithstanding, at the strategic level, in some ways, Putin has forced China's hand in ways that it did not want to be doing. And that is another level of tension. And the third is, while inflation, high fuel prices, high food prices hits the global south, it is not a very good image for China to be close to Russia, which is in many ways the catalyst for these disasters befalling on the global south.
Great. So we only have a few more minutes left, but I do want to just get this last question in. Somebody asked, what do you make of China's recent agreement with Pakistan to extend the BRI initiative to Afghanistan? And also, briefly, someone asked if you could share that PRISM article earlier that you mentioned in the chat box before the end.
I can't share it because I won't be able to access it while we're here. But Bill, can I impose on you to find that and circulate it? It's
yes. Just tell me again, what's the name of it?
The BRI and its rivals.
Great. Yeah, you can go ahead and answer the question, and I will. Okay. I'll find that. And
yeah, the journal is the PRISM from the National Defense University in Washington. The question was of Pakistan and China and Afghanistan. Not surprisingly, China is the biggest investor in Afghanistan. Who knew, right? Also, not surprisingly, China has been cultivating links with American-occupied Afghanistan as well as post-American occupied Afghanistan, and has regarded this as a very significant part of its kind of westward pivot. For China, American withdrawal last August 2022 is, message from God that we can now develop links with Afghanistan. And given that China is not really interested in who rules Afghanistan, so long as they don't interfere in China's own Muslim population, Afghanistan is there for the taking as far as China is concerned. And it's important. Why? Because it ties Afghanistan nicely into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, which goes all the way down to the Arabian Sea, truly. Also, it means that China's position on the western boundaries of South Asia in relation to India are are more solid. And also, hopefully, China will be able to stabilize Afghanistan. That would then hopefully stabilize Pakistan. I myself don't hold much hope in either of those last two things. Pakistan is in deep crisis, and Afghanistan is not going to recover anytime soon. But nevertheless, at the abstract level, you could see that, the chips are moving in China's direction. But whether China can capitalize on that, I think, is a moot point, because Afghanistan is not Pakistan, certainly, and Pakistan is not Saudi Arabia, certainly.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anoush, for a fantastic talk and a really, really interesting and in-depth Q&A session. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. Once again, this is the Center for Geopolitics and the Indo-Pacific Program. We are very, very lucky to have Professor Ehteshami here with us today. Thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, everybody, for staying around so late in the evening as well. Try and get a decent supper, and those who watch it later, good morning all.
All right, have a good one, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.